I'm going to be talking to Seth Klein, a policy analyst and author of A Good War, a book about Canadian climate policy, and his response to Dr. Mark Jaccard's analysis of the Canadian political parties' election platform climate plans. And he had some interesting things to say about the Liberals, the Conservatives, and Jaccard. It caused a little controversy on social media yesterday. Welcome to the interview, Seth.
Hi, nice to be with you. Let's
start with the full title of your book, please, because I never get it right.
Okay. It's A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Out a year ago.
And I'll make the point that I interviewed Seth about this in the spring, and I'll put a link in the YouTube to that interview. So if you're interested, you can watch that as well. Seth, you wrote an op-ed in the National Observer yesterday. And why don't we start there? Give us an overview of your argument.
Well, I was moved to write the piece in response to Mark Jaccard's piece in Policy Options, in which he offered ratings of the climate policy platforms of the four major parties. And it got a lot of media highlighting the fact that he had rated the Liberal platform rather exceptionally high, well beyond any of the other parties. The order of his ratings was Liberals, then the Conservatives, then the Greens, then the NDP, with a very large gap between those. So I wanted to dig in, and as I dug into his piece, I found it fairly nonsensical. I think a lot of people were surprised and thought it was counterintuitive. And I respect the fact that Mark has done some good climate analysis over the years, but I didn't think his piece made any sense. And of course, not surprisingly, the piece was sort of instantly weaponized in the political sphere and turned into Liberal talking points and so on, in a way that just seemed, inaccurate to me.
Well, look, let's go through your objections one by one. So let's start with the first one.
Well, so the main thing that Mark was seeking to measure was the language he uses is how sincere are the parties. And his matrix for measuring that sincerity was how plausible, how credible was a party's climate platform to meet its own stated target for 2030. The problem with that, and so he finds that the Liberals have presented a platform with a credible plan to hit their 2030 target, which is to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. You know, that's a legitimate point of view. Other people would think that they aren't on the path to meet that, but fair enough. You rank the Conservatives second because they only have a target of 30% reductions. And then he finds they have a credible plan to meet that. Although that seemed like even more of a stretch because the carbon pricing plan is a real rollback of what we're what we have on the table at the moment. They lower the price, but they also, the Conservatives have this cockamamie plan of taking all the revenues and putting that into individual savings plans in a way that, Mark bases all of this on his modeling. I don't know how his modeling captures a cockamamie plan like the Conservative plan. The whole idea of these models is you price carbon and you expect a certain impact in terms of people's behavior. But when the Conservatives are recycling all the money individually in this way, I don't know that anyone's ever been able to really model that. The main problem I have with this is that it strikes me that this is less of a sincerity test and more like a student self-evaluation. He's simply judging this based on the party's own targets without actually asking, is the target sufficient?
Well, look, I mean, I've interviewed Mark about this, and again, I'll put the link in with this video. But I think what he would say about the NDP, because you dealt with the NDP primarily in your op-ed, what he would say is that the economic impact of the things like rolling back output-based allocations on industrial emitter carbon pricing, those sorts of things in his model, and I should say also Navius Research's model,
which is based on his model. Yeah.
right, exactly. It led to a decline. The cost to the economy would be 6.5% of GDP. The Liberals were 2.5% of GDP. So he sees that as an economist, he called it, economic efficiency. So that, I think, is where the Liberals got the high ranking and the NDP got a lower ranking.
So this is another piece that I have trouble with, which is he's basically set it up in a way that penalizes ambition. The more a platform sets an ambitious target and tries to develop a program that actually aligns with what the science and the IPCC says we must do, the higher he then finds the cost, and therefore that's a mark against the platform in the matrix that he has set up. So that's another problem I have with it. But I also think, and again, all I have to work on, I haven't seen how he enters all of this stuff in the model. All we have to work on is what's the results that are shared in the policy options piece. But the basic assumption that that kind of level of ambition will be a drag on the economy, on employment, I think is highly debatable. I actually think a truly bold, brash, Green New Deal type plan where we spend with ambition to meet this goal would be positive to GDP and employment. And in fact, that is the record of the kinds of spending that we have just seen in the pandemic. I mean, the economic impact would have been brutal had it not been for that spending. And on the flip side, as we started with this interview, my whole book is structured around lessons from the Second World War, when the level of public spending was dramatically higher than any of what we're talking about right now. And that had the result of doubling GDP and banishing unemployment. And by the way, the kind of really state-led transformation of World War II, which I've argued for as an approach to climate, he can't model. The model doesn't function in a way to deal with those kinds of ideas, industrial policy ideas. The model has its purpose. The modeling lets you test certain specific policies to see what impact it has on behavior and choices, but it can't model the kind of speed and scale industrial transformation that the science says is now necessary.
Right, but your book was not one of the things being modeled. The NDP plan is 50% emissions reductions by 2030. So it's more stringent than the Liberals, but only 10%. I mean, it's not like the NDP is lined up with
with what I'm calling for.
That you
That's
talk
right.
about in your book.
Fair point, exactly. And let me be clear, I find that frustrating. Like my piece was not actually a defense of the NDP platform. I find the NDP platform frustrating as well. I just felt a need to push back on a piece that I thought made no sense. And the defense that I offer of the NDP platform in my piece yesterday is that I think Mark had two problems there. First of all, he seemed, if I understand what he's laid out in his article correctly, he seemed to assume that the NDP isn't going to proceed with the carbon pricing in the Liberal plan with their schedule. That's incorrect. The NDP plan is all additional to the schedule up to $170 a ton. And additionally, it applies it more stringently on industry. You can have a legitimate debate about that, but that was their plan. But also there's some real game-changing ideas in the NDP platform, which he doesn't model and therefore ignores. For example, he says the NDP are talking about carbon budgeting. Now, I think that's really important. I think that would allow us to achieve something much faster than a 2030 target. He flat out says it's too complicated and he can't model it. I don't know why. It's been key to meeting actual GHG reductions in the UK.
Two ideas you introduced here, and I want to deal with both of them. One of them is the idea of the industrial emitters carbon pricing. So right now we have output-based allocation. So whatever it's at $50 a ton now, most industries get an 80 or 90% reduction. And that's what the NDP said about, they said they were going to roll back the giveaways to, the Liberals' corporate buddies. It's not a giveaway. It's meant to stop carbon leakage, which is everybody acknowledges that carbon leakage is a problem. So
well, except, Mark also says, he criticizes the NDP for not talking about border adjustments, and that may be a legitimate criticism if that isn't in fact part of the NDP's plan. But I actually think we do need to impose it more harshly on industry if we're going to proceed with carbon pricing. And if there's a leakage problem, we need to deal with it at the border. And that's how we make sure that these things will have the teeth required to actually hit our targets. But I don't want to fixate on this because, as you know, my books, I'm in favor of carbon pricing, but I don't actually think it's the key piece of how we meet these goals.
Right. And so let's talk about carbon budgets, because I'll be honest with you, I don't know much about them. So please explain what they are and why you think they'd work in the Canadian context.
Well, so they use them in the UK, where on rolling 5 years, the whole of society and government says this is what the diminishing carbon budget is, and then you can allocate it by sector. What I like, and interestingly, the Liberals themselves are playing with this a little bit in the sense that they're now saying for the first time, this is good, we're going to set a cap for the oil and gas sector and it's going to diminish over time. That's effectively a carbon budget. But to my mind, what it means is we take what we all know well in fiscal budgeting and we apply it to carbon. So, as a society, we know what that looks like. Governments have annual budgets. They tend to set rolling 3-year budgets. They have a consultation process. There's federal provincial negotiations around the divvying up of transfers. We know how much they're spending by different sector. We have an auditor general to make sure that they're doing it well. We have a parliamentary budget officer who gives us good projections to work with. That architecture influences the whole of how government operates. That's what we need in the face of the climate emergency. We need to map that same architecture and machinery of government into meeting this challenge now. That's what it would mean to me.
Okay, but one of the things I argue, Seth, is I don't think, and the Liberals get enough credit for the extent to which they have redone the architecture around energy and climate policy since 2015. And you can argue that it may not be enough, but it's certainly far more extensive than the Chrétien government, the Martin government, the Harper governments, any of those governments.
I'm prepared to give some credit there. I'm not prepared to give him an 8 out of 10 on credibility, which is what felt so counterintuitive to me. First of all, I think we should go into this appreciating that the modeling that is done by Navius and others is imperfect. And so it's important to use it to do some forward modeling, but look at the record. Now, the record is that we have not bent the curve. Our emissions are still modestly going up each year. And I think part of that is because, well, first of all, some of that change in architecture is starting to have an impact. And so far anyway, it's completely been undone by expansion of oil and gas emissions, because for whatever political reasons or what have you, until 2 weeks ago, the Liberals didn't want to touch that. you
See,
know,
here's
they
where if you don't mind me jumping in, Seth, I don't
go
do
ahead.
this very often, but I want to make a point here because I put out a video column about this, criticizing the conservatives, whose plan is rendered incredible in my view, because they want expansion of oil and gas over and above the 1.4 million barrels a day BOE by 2030, and
Right.
there's no way they're going to hit their targets
No
if they
way.
get another pipeline and more
That's
LNG
right.
units.
Which is why I found it incredulous that they were ranked second in Jaccard's piece. Look, to your point, there is clearly a difference between the liberal and the conservative approaches and plans. But my main critique, and I've made it to the liberals in my own discussions with the environment minister and so on, and this is where I differ in the approach I take in my book. They are still trying to incentivize their way to victory. Through price signals, through rebates. The last budget offers a 50% tax cut for corporations that will produce what we need to produce. Now, let me be clear. Those things are not without consequence, but as you said a moment ago, they will not achieve what we need to achieve at the speed and scale required. In which case, we're fried. As Bill McKibben likes to say, to win slowly on climate change is to lose. And I don't hear any of the parties, including the liberals, talking about this with the public with that clarity, which is why, I would mark them all fairly low for their refusal to do that.
Yes, and I've made the point again, I don't know how many times I've made this point now, is that what the liberals do, is their strategy from the time they got in was to try to, with policy, with carbon pricing and regulations, decarbonize oil and gas while letting market forces determine supply. And as long as supply is rising, emissions never go down, ever.
Right. And I wanted to come back because there's two other things in the NDP platform that I find most intriguing that, again, Mark simply ignores because his model can't know how to deal with them. And in fairness to him, one of them is tough because the NDP hasn't presented their costing, which apparently I just heard on the news they're going to do tomorrow. But first of all, there's this idea of a citizen climate corps. Now, depending on how big that is, that could be transformative. That could mean, thousands of young people coming out of high school deciding, like they did a generation ago in the face of the war, to spend a couple of years meeting this moment with us. The other thing that, oddly, it's in their platform. I haven't heard any of their leaders actually talk about it. They talk about embedding the GHG targets within Crown corporations, within the Canada Pension Plan mandate, within Crown the Export Development Corporation, but most intriguingly, embedding it in the mandate of the Bank of Canada. Now, this comes to the question of how do we pay for all of this? Depending how serious they are about that, we could have climate quantitative easing. Look what just happened. And again, Mark's model can't capture this. In the pandemic, for the whole first year, the Bank of Canada purchased $5 billion a week in federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response. Imagine if we did that for climate at a fraction of that level. I mean, I'm only asking for like 40 billion a year, not 5 billion a week, but we could transform this in a way that, again, the modeling wouldn't capture.
Well, and I think that's fair. I mean, I don't think that Mark would disagree that the model has limitations. Every model does, and I think but he's not here to defend it either, and I'm certainly not capable of it. So one of the things I want to move on to, though, Seth, is a lot of you criticize the liberals for far too many carrots. And I assume from our conversations and what I've read of your stuff that you would like to introduce a lot more sticks, as well as control, the government controlling. And this is one of the things, I just had an interview with Kingsmill Bond from Carbon Tractor carbon tracker, who argues that and I agree with this, the energy transition is literally an industrial transformation, and this is the opportunity for wealth creation, to transform the way economies work. They're more prosperous, they're cleaner, they're safer, they're all of those things, and there's not enough of that.
I agree with that. So let me take a step back. You say carrots and sticks. So yeah, let me actually walk you through what I have as my 4 markers of real emergency mode. You spend what it takes to win. Okay, so there's your carrots. Number 2 speaks to the point you just made. You create new economic institutions to get the job done, in particular, new crown corporations to do what you just described. The reason why I fixate a bit on the role of crown corporations is that if you're not building new crown corporations, as we did in the war, by the way, we created 28, C.D. Howe created 28 crown corporations. If you're not doing that, the best you can do is try to incentivize somebody else through whatever carrots or tax credits or tax cuts to do what needs doing. Some of them will, but not at the speed and scale required. So we should create those new institutions. And if they're public, as you just pointed out, a bunch of them are going to make money. And that should come back to the public too. The third marker, though, are the sticks, which is that we shift from voluntary measures to mandatory measures. That's what we did in the war. That's what we did in the pandemic. That's what we have not yet done, or to the extent that the parties, Liberals and the NDP, by the way, and the Conservatives, people talk about mandatory measures for vehicles now, like you're not going to be able to buy a fossil fuel combustion vehicle, but the dates are the opposite of emergency, 2035, 2040. And the fourth marker is you tell the truth with the public. You're forthright with the public. And I don't think we've heard that. There's a fifth I also like to introduce, and where I have a critique of Mark again, which is that you recognize the link between ambitious climate action and tackling inequality. And Mark doesn't like to do that. He thinks that's messy. He thinks that just complicates things. I think it's how we win. Because when you're asking society to engage in a grand undertaking together, a bit of a leap into the unknown, people have to know that this is being done in a manner that is fair and equitable, and that a more just society is going to emerge at the other end of this transition, which is why you can't actually separate a party's climate platform, what we narrowly call their climate platform, from everything they're also proposing to do to tackle inequality and create more tax fairness. They're not separate. They're the same. They ought to be seen as integrated.
Well, let me ask you this question, because I think you've been a little harsher on Mark's and Navius's model than is called for under the circumstances, because models have limitations. That's all there is to it. And you pointed out a number of them, and I guess that's fair. Fair. It's cricket. So how do we take this conversation to the next level? Look, the kind of conversation that you and I are having now is not the kind of conversation that's reflected in your op-ed, your National Observer op-ed. So how do we get that? Well, I that's my take on it. We'll discuss that another time. But how do we get to this more sophisticated discussion of the kind of issues that you're bringing to the table and the need to have a different approach to policy? How do we do that?
Well, this is how I'm spending my life now, Markham. After my book came out a year ago, I've created this climate emergency unit, and we're trying to insert these markers of emergency and what that actually means into the public conversation. And we're very busy doing it. And I would say it's finding a lot of resonance. I think the public is ahead of our politics. The public gets the emergency, although the level of climate literacy is not terrific. And that's a problem, right? So half the population doesn't know the main cause of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. And so when you poll them, are you worried about, are you increasingly anxious about climate? Yes, I am. What should we do about it? Well, people go right to plastics and recycle, right? And it's, it's very easy for some political parties to make mischief with that low level of literacy. But particularly after the summer we've just had, people get that the emergency is here and now. It's not some distant place. And part of why I think I've encountered a lot of resonance with the book and the message of the unit is people are hungry for some clarity about, people are passing climate emergency motions at the municipal level and in their institutions, but they're wrestling still with what does that mean to be in emergency mode? And I'm offering up these 4 markers, and I'm saying, look, this is what we did in the war. And also, spend what it takes, create new institutions, move to mandatory, tell the truth. We actually just did that in the pandemic. So this is not unfamiliar to us. Now we have to apply it to climate.
Well, Seth, every time I interview, it's always a fascinating conversation. I appreciate this. And so let's wrap this up. I think that somehow the conversation that got started around Mark Jaccard's analysis, your critique of it, there's got to be some synthesis of that, that we can then use to further that conversation. So does it take place behind closed doors with policymakers? Does it take place in the media? Does it take place at conferences? Where is it going to take place?
Well, so first of all, let me be clear. I think modeling has a role to play. It can be helpful as a way of testing the effectiveness of different policies. What I'm asking in the piece is, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. Does it feel like the approach of our federal government looks and sounds and feel like an emergency? No. But the next government needs to meet this moment with us. It's got to feel that way. So my main takeaway, part of why I reacted to the piece is I could see the Liberals kind of weaponizing it to try to win the majority that they sought in calling this election. Let me be frank. I think the path to victory in this emergency is very narrow. But what will help it is actually to have another minority government. Now, in the system we have, we don't get to pick that, but I would be happy if we emerge a couple of weeks from now with another minority government, and recognizing, though, that none of the parties have presented to the public true climate emergency plans. Where I'm putting my hopes and efforts and donations and working, my volunteer work is electing people I consider to be true climate emergency champions. And they're not all from just the NDP, by the way. But if we have a minority government, and if we increase the squad, the people of who are real emergencies, climate justice champions, who are in it to win it in this emergency moment, who will press their parties, and who will demand that if we have a minority government, the basis of negotiation and agreement to secure the confidence of the House will be real climate emergency action. That's where I'm placing my hopes.
Seth, I will wrap this up now by saying that I find this argument you're making in this interview more convincing than the one in your op-ed. So okay. stick with this one as opposed to the one. Anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks.